A review into building regulations following the Grenfell tower fire says there should be a culture change to ensure that safety is prioritised over cost. Dame Judith Hackett, who's carrying out the review for the government, makes a series of recommendations to simplify the rules and change the way they're overseen. In her interim report out this morning, she also says regulations are confusing and open to interpretation.
The interim report tells us that what we have in place today is a system which has evolved over a number of years. It's overly complex, and that complexity doesn't lead to it being as effective as it needs to be.
And then if you could go into some more detail, please. I mean, what sort of things specifically are we talking about here?
We're talking about a system which is where there's too much prescription, where there is a very heavily layered system of guidance currently, which is not helpful in terms of leading people to the right answer. So my aim for the future is to create a much simpler and more straightforward system that will be easier for people to follow, but that needs to be reinforced with a number of changes in behaviour, which will include a major culture change across all of the players in this. It needs a radical rethink of how competence is measured, because we don't know enough about people's qualifications to make particular decisions in relation to high-rise buildings. We also need to have a system which is much more effective and much clearer about how products are tested, and we need to be very clear about who's responsible for what in this system, because part of what I've found is that it's not clear who takes ownership for what part of the decision-making process, and for me that's very, very important.
Which groups are we talking about there? Is this central government, local authorities?
Some of this is about the people who build properties. Some of it is about the people who regulate that building process, or those who advise on the building process. But what I would also emphasise is that when I talk about looking at the system as a whole, this has not just been about new build. This is also about how you manage the life cycle of a building, because buildings are in use for very, very much longer than they are being built. And even if you start out with a building that has been built to the standards, people living in it, particularly multiple occupancy high-rise buildings, there are many changes that get made in the life cycle of a building. And in a multiple occupancy building, that needs to be controlled properly. It needs to be managed in such a way that the integrity that was originally designed into the building is maintained.
And that was Dame Judith Hackett. Well, let's get reaction now from the Royal Institute of British Architects, RIBA, which contributed to Dame Judith's review. Its Executive Director, Adrian Dobson, joins me now. And Adrian, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. And in your contribution to this interim report and to the overall review, you say at RIBA that there have been issues with both the regulations and also how those regulations are enforced.
Yes, that's right, and I think Dame Judith's made a good start in looking at both aspects. She promised a very thorough review. I think our sense is that she's made a lot of progress on how the regulations are enforced and managed, but perhaps less so on the actual guidance that the industry uses to comply with the fire requirements of the building regulations. OK,
well, let's look at the first of those points and how what those regulations are. I mean, a number of issues have been looked at, haven't they, since Grenfell? We've been looking at smoke alarms, retrofitting of smoke alarms, single stairwells to access or exit high-rise buildings. What are your opinions on all of that, and what needs to be done to better improve safety?
I think that's the slightly disappointing element of today's report, in that we've got some real concerns about what's called Approved Document B. This is the government guidance that the construction industry uses to help it comply with the building regulations. in relation to fire, and we believe this is a very flawed and confusing document. I think that's illustrated by the fact that we've got so many high-rise residential buildings that we now know have serious fire safety concerns, not just related to cladding but to other elements, and we've really had quite a major regulatory and compliance failure on the regulatory side.
Why is there a failure on the regulatory side?
Well, for example, I think what illustrates that failure is the fact that we've got over 200 high-rise buildings that apparently have complied with the building regulations. They've been signed off by the building control authorities, and yet we know that there are serious issues with them that have come out in further survey work. So, for example, the approved document at the moment creates this concept of a material of limited combustibility, and you can use these materials to clad high-rise buildings. I think our view is that regulation needs to be changed, and we should only be using non-combustible materials on high-rise residential towers and actually all high-rise buildings.
So, if those fall within the regulations, when it comes to enforcing the regulations, it's difficult for someone to say, well, you know, I don't think this is safe. Yeah. Because actually, according to the standard guidelines, it falls within permitted development, I suppose.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think the problem is that there's so much ambiguity within the regulations, and it relies so much on these complex testing methodologies that we think it needs to be simpler and more straightforward. So there are things that we think are problematic within the existing regulations. There are also things that could be immediately improved. So, for example, new residential buildings over 30 metres high have to have sprinklers, but other residential buildings don't. If you do what's called material alterations, if you refurbish, for example, a tower block, you have to make what are called consequential improvements, and you have to improve the energy performance of those buildings, but you don't have to improve the fire performance and bring it up to the current standard. I think, interestingly, that is something that Dame Judith has picked up on, and I think we'll see that change eventually. But we would have liked to have seen an immediate review of the approved document. We think it's very problematic.
OK, well, thank you very much for sharing your views with us this morning. Adrian Dobson from the